There is a photograph taken sometime in the early 1970s. Alexander Onassis, young, dark-haired, leaning against a boat somewhere in the Mediterranean sun. He looks like someone who has everything, and technically he did. His father was one of the wealthiest men on earth. His family name was printed on tankers, airlines, islands. He had grown up moving between palaces and yachts, and the kind of dinner tables where world leaders sat across from film stars. He was 24 years old in that photograph, and he had maybe 2 years left to live. This is not a story about wealth. It's about what wealth cannot protect you from. About a young man caught between a father who dominated everything he touched, a world that watched his every move, and a fate that arrived without warning on a January morning in Greece. Most people know the name Onassis. Far fewer know the son. Segment 7. Born into the eye of a storm. Alexander Onassis came into the world on April 23rd, 1948, in Athens, Greece. His father, Aristotle Onassis, was already well on his way to becoming a legend, a self-made shipping magnate who had climbed out of near poverty in Smyrna, survived the collapse of his hometown, emigrated with almost nothing, and built an empire through relentless ambition and a talent for negotiation that bordered on the mythological. His mother was Athena Mary Livanos, daughter of another powerful Greek shipping family. The marriage between Aristotle and Athena Livanos was, by most accounts, a union of two dynasties rather than two people deeply in love. Athena was 17 when she married Aristotle. He was 37. The gap wasn't just age, it was everything. Temperament, desire, worldview. She wanted stability. He wanted conquest. And conquest was what he was going to get, whether it fit inside a marriage or not. Alexander grew up with his sister, Christina, who was born a year later in 1950. The two children were close in the way that siblings become close when the adults around them are perpetually distracted. Their parents' marriage was turbulent from early on, marked by Aristotle's long absences, his roving attention, and a restlessness that made him a brilliant businessman and a difficult husband. Athena Livanos was a gentle, private woman who found the spectacle of Onassis' life increasingly exhausting. They moved between homes, a villa in Athens, apartments in Paris, time aboard the Christina, the legendary yacht named after Alexander's sister that Aristotle had converted from a Canadian frigate into something closer to a floating palace. There were staff, tutors, security, the constant hum of importance. And in the middle of it all, two children trying to understand what family meant when their father was always somewhere else, and their mother was slowly retreating from a world she hadn't signed up for. Aristotle was not indifferent to his children, but he was not present in the way children need. He was the kind of father who could make you feel like the center of the universe when he was in the room, and then vanish for weeks. He taught Alexander about the sea, about ships, about the mechanics of business, about the importance of strength. He had opinions about everything, delivered them with absolute authority, and expected them to be absorbed. Alexander absorbed them, and also quietly resisted them, which would turn out to be the central tension of his short life. By the time Alexander was a teenager, his parents' marriage had all but dissolved in practice, though they would not formally divorce until 1960. When the split came, it was Athena who left, and she eventually remarried to Aristotle's chief rival in the shipping world, Stavros Niarchos. The irony was so sharp, it seemed almost scripted. Aristotle did not take it quietly. The rivalry between Onassis and Niarchos was one of the defining feuds of the mid-20th century shipping world. Two men who had come from similar backgrounds, built similar empires, and developed a mutual hostility that was professional, personal, and ultimately almost mythological in its intensity. They competed over ships, over contracts, over influence, over social status. And now, with the remarriage of Athena Livanos, their rivalry had been inscribed inside Alexander's own family. His mother's new husband was his father's oldest enemy. There was no way for a teenager to process that cleanly. The divorce left Alexander and Christina in a complicated position, shuttled between parents, between worlds, between the expectations of a father who was building a mythology around himself and the grief of a mother who was disappearing into a different life. Christina took it hardest, in ways that would haunt her for decades. Alexander internalized it differently. He grew quieter, more careful, more determined to find something that was entirely his own. The education he received was international and expensive. Schools in Switzerland, tutors arranged across Europe, the kind of curriculum designed to produce someone fluent in multiple languages and at ease in multiple cultures. He was educated for a life in which the world was his operating territory, which was accurate enough, but which also meant he grew up without the kind of stable, rooted childhood that most people take for granted. The friendships of his early years were often short-lived by necessity. You don't form lasting bonds with classmates when you're moved between countries on your father's schedule. What he took from all of that, by the time he reached his late teens, was a particular kind of self-sufficiency. He had learned to be comfortable with his own company, to find his own interests without waiting for someone to direct him toward them, and to distinguish between the people in his orbit who were genuinely drawn to him and the ones who were drawn to the name. That last skill is harder to develop than it sounds, and it's especially hard when you're a teenager whose name is one of the most famous in the world. And he found it. Two things that were entirely his own, both of which put him on a direct collision course with his father, both of which would define everything that followed. Segment 6. The Pilot and the Older Woman. There were two things Alexander Onassis wanted that his father did not approve of. The first was flying. The second was Fiona Thyssen. He developed a passion for aviation in his late teens, a genuine, consuming love for it, not the casual enthusiasm of a rich boy collecting hobbies. He pursued a pilot's license with real seriousness and became a skilled flyer. There was something about being in the air that suited him, the self-reliance of it, the technical precision required, the fact that altitude made no exceptions for surnames or bank accounts. You either flew the plane correctly or you didn't. Aristotle hated it. Not flying in general. He had no particular fear of aircraft. He hated that his son, his heir, the young man who was supposed to inherit and expand an empire built from the sea, was spending his time in the sky. There were arguments about it, the kind of arguments that only happen between fathers and sons, when what's really being argued about is something much larger than the stated subject. Aristotle wanted Alexander focused on shipping, on business, on the continuation of everything he had built. Alexander wanted to be allowed to be something other than a continuation. Fiona Thyssen was the other flashpoint. She was born Fiona Campbell Walter, a Scottish model who had been one of the most photographed women in Europe during the 1950s. By the time she and Alexander met, she had been married to the German industrialist Hans Heinrich Thyssen-Bornemisza and had children from that marriage. She was 17 years older than Alexander. She was sophisticated, independent, and deeply fond of him in a way that seemed genuine on both sides. Alexander was, by all accounts, completely devoted to her. Aristotle was appalled. The reasons he gave were practical: the age gap, her previous marriage, the children she already had. But underneath the practical objections was something more instinctive and territorial. Aristotle Onassis was a man who controlled things. He controlled his ships, his deals, his image, his dinner tables. The idea that his son had chosen someone entirely outside the carefully maintained world of Greek shipping dynasties and social propriety. Someone older, someone with her own history, someone who answered to no one, was a kind of defiance he found genuinely difficult to absorb. He did not simply disapprove. He made the disapproval known, loudly and consistently, and put pressure on Alexander to end things. Alexander refused. He and Fiona maintained their relationship for years, living together for extended periods, openly devoted to each other in a way that was visible to everyone around them. What made this more remarkable was the specific nature of what Alexander was refusing. He was refusing his father, a man who had faced down governments, outmaneuvered some of the wealthiest and most connected businessmen in the world, and who operated with the unshakable conviction that his judgment was correct in all things. Saying no to Aristotle Onassis was not simply an act of personal stubbornness. It required a particular kind of nerve that most people who encountered Aristotle professionally and personally found impossible to sustain. Alexander sustained it. Fiona herself was not a fragile figure in any of this. She had built her own identity in the years before she met Alexander. She was a woman of real presence and accomplishment, who had navigated a world not known for its generosity toward independent women on her own terms. She was not intimidated by the Onassis machinery, and the fact that she was 17 years older than Alexander seemed to genuinely not matter between them. By all accounts, they operated as equals, sharing an intellectual intimacy and a sense of humor that made the relationship feel grounded rather than transactional. There was something in their dynamic that suggested he had found in her what he couldn't quite find elsewhere in his life. Someone who knew exactly who he was, had no interest in the performance of wealth and celebrity, and simply wanted the actual person. For a young man whose name and circumstances had made authenticity genuinely rare in his relationships, that must have been remarkable. It was one of the few areas in which Alexander held his ground completely, and those who knew him well said it revealed something important about who he was. That beneath the quiet exterior was someone with his own convictions, his own sense of what mattered, his own definition of loyalty. He was not, despite everything, simply a shadow of his father. He was becoming his own person. But becoming your own person inside the Onassis orbit was never simple. Aristotle had opinions and the resources to make those opinions felt. He dangled inheritance, threatened access to the businesses, made clear that disagreement had consequences. It was a kind of emotional leverage that no amount of flying lessons or devoted relationships could fully neutralize. Still, Alexander stayed. He stayed with Fiona, stayed connected to his passion for aviation, stayed in a complicated relationship with a father he both loved and resented. He took on increasing responsibilities within the Onassis shipping and business world as he moved through his early 20s, learning the operations, making himself useful, demonstrating that he was capable. He was being groomed for succession in the practical sense, shown the mechanics of the empire, introduced to key figures, given decisions to make and problems to solve. He approached this work seriously, which surprised some people who had expected a dilettante. He was not a dilettante. He paid attention, asked questions that demonstrated genuine comprehension, and built a working knowledge of a business that was genuinely complex. And then, on the morning of January 23rd, 1973, he climbed into an amphibious Piaggio aircraft at the Hellenikon airport in Athens. He was 24 years old. He had been doing this for years. He knew what he was doing. What happened next changed everything. And what came after the crash would shake Aristotle Onassis down to his foundation in ways that no business loss or personal rivalry ever had. Segment 5. The Crash. The details of what went wrong on that January morning have been discussed and debated for decades, and they remain, even now, not entirely settled. What is known? Alexander Onassis was at the controls of an amphibious Piaggio P-136 aircraft at Hellenikon Airport. With him were two other men, Donald McGregor, an American pilot who was an employee of Olympic Aviation, the Onassis-owned airline, and a flight instructor named Corneros. The plane took off, climbed briefly, and then something went catastrophically wrong almost immediately after takeoff. The aircraft came down hard. Alexander, seated at the controls, took the worst of it. The impact caused severe head trauma. His skull was fractured, and his brain injury was immediate and devastating. The other two men in the plane survived with injuries far less severe. Alexander was pulled from the wreckage alive, but unconscious, and rushed to the hospital in a condition that was already, from the first hours, deeply uncertain. The scene at the hospital in Athens in the hours following the crash was, by any account, extraordinary. Word moved fast in the world Aristotle Onassis inhabited, and the people who appeared at the hospital, friends, associates, press, people connected to the family's vast network of business and social relationships, reflected the sheer scale of the life Alexander had been born into. But none of that scale or connection or influence could change what the doctors were looking at. The scans and assessments told a story that had no comfortable reading. What caused the crash was never settled. The most troubling explanation, and the one that Aristotle Onassis would spend the rest of his life pushing, was that the aircraft's control system had been improperly connected, installed in a way that reversed the pilot's inputs entirely. Under that scenario, every correction Alexander attempted would have made things worse. No skill, no experience, no instinct could have compensated for it. It would have meant the plane was doomed before it left the ground. Investigators examined the maintenance records of Olympic Aviation, the Onassis-owned airline responsible for the aircraft. What they found was genuinely inconclusive. Not cleared, not proven, just unresolved. Aristotle called it sabotage. He named enemies, initiated legal processes, and never fully abandoned the belief that someone had put his son in an aircraft they knew would fall. Whether he was right is a question that history did not answer. What it did answer, quickly and without mercy, was that Alexander was gone. He was taken first to a hospital in Athens, and then, as word spread and his father mobilized every resource available to him, a team of neurosurgeons was assembled. Aristotle flew in specialists from around the world. He was not a man who accepted limits, and he refused to accept this one. He reportedly spent a staggering sum in those first days, millions of dollars, on medical consultations, specialists, experimental interventions, anything that offered even the thinnest possibility of a different outcome. The doctors were honest with him. The brain damage was extensive. The kind of injury Alexander had sustained was one from which people did not wake up and then go on to be who they had been. The best that could be hoped for, even in the most optimistic scenario, was a life of permanent and severe impairment. Aristotle, who had spent his entire life bending reality to his will through force of personality and resources, could not bend this. Alexander remained on life support. Days passed. His condition did not improve. The world watched, because the world always watched when Onassis was involved, and the news came in a trickle of grim updates that left very little room for hope. Fiona Thyssen came to Athens and was at his side. The family gathered, and Aristotle Onassis, one of the most powerful men in the world, sat in a hospital in Athens and found himself completely powerless. What the next 33 hours looked like, and what they did to Aristotle, is something that people who witnessed it never quite recovered from describing. Segment 4: 33 Hours and a Father's Grief. The decision to remove Alexander from life support came on January 23, 1973, one day after the crash. He died on January 24, 1973. He was 24 years old. The speed of it, the way it moved from crash to death in little more than a day, was shocking, even to those who had been told from the beginning that there was no realistic hope. Aristotle Onassis had reportedly been told by his doctors that his son's brain had no meaningful function remaining, and that continuing life support was not extending a life, but prolonging a death. He authorized the decision, and then he had to live with having made it. What followed for Aristotle Onassis was a collapse, not physical, though that came too, but something internal and fundamental. People who knew him well in the years before Alexander's death described a man who was formidable in every room he entered, who generated energy and presence, and the particular magnetism of someone who has never seriously doubted his own importance. After January 1973, that person began to disappear. He gave interviews in the period following Alexander's death, in which he spoke about his son with a rawness that was startling from someone so habitually controlled in public. He talked about Alexander as the center of everything he had built, the point of all of it. What was an empire without someone to leave it to? What was the accumulation of a lifetime if the person you had built it for was gone? These were not rhetorical questions. They seemed to be questions he was actually, desperately trying to answer. He blamed himself in ways that were specific and painful. The arguments about flying, the pressure over Fiona, the times he had pushed Alexander toward the business rather than listening to what his son actually wanted. Whether those decisions had any connection to the crash was not the point. Grief does not operate according to logic, and Aristotle's grief was enormous and had nowhere to go. He had spent 40 years being the most powerful person in any room he entered, and none of that had mattered in the end. It is a particular kind of reckoning that very few people experience with that kind of force, and he was experiencing it without any preparation for it. The conspiracy belief, the insistence that the crash was deliberate, was something he clung to publicly and privately in a way that alarmed people around him. Some thought it was a coping mechanism. Others believed he genuinely couldn't accept that a random mechanical failure, an ordinary bad morning, had been enough to take his son. The idea of a faceless, purposeless accident was in some ways harder to absorb than the idea of an enemy, because an enemy could be confronted, pursued, held accountable. An accident could not. He was a man who had never in his life accepted being powerless, and so he constructed a version of events in which he was not. The physical decline came quickly. Aristotle Onassis was diagnosed with myasthenia gravis, a neuromuscular condition that causes progressive muscle weakness, in 1973, and while the disease had likely been developing before Alexander's death, it accelerated noticeably in the period after. He lost weight. He lost the sharpness that had always defined him. He was photographed in 1974, looking like a different person than the one the world had known, diminished, tired, his famous eyes heavier than they had ever been. He died in March 1975, a little over 2 years after Alexander. He was 69 years old. The official cause was pneumonia, complicated by the effects of myasthenia gravis. But those closest to him said quietly that he had never recovered from January 1973, that something had broken in him that no doctor could repair and no wealth could replace. The empire he left behind passed to his daughter Christina, who had her own catastrophic relationship with it. But that is another story. What matters here is what the loss of Alexander meant, not just to Aristotle, but to the larger question of what kind of life Alexander had been living and what kind of life he might have had. Segment 3. Who Alexander actually was. The difficulty with writing about Alexander Onassis is that so much of what has been recorded about him passes through the lens of his father or through the aftermath of his death. The independent portrait, Alexander as he actually was, day to day, in rooms where Aristotle wasn't watching, is harder to reconstruct. But it's worth trying. People who knew him personally described someone quite different from the tabloid image of a jet-set heir. He was quiet where his father was loud. He was thoughtful where Aristotle was impulsive. He had a dry sense of humour that appeared in private and almost never in public. He was genuinely curious about mechanical things. Aviation, yes, but also the technical workings of ships, engines, systems. He was not simply performing interest in these things to please his father or to seem grounded. He found them genuinely absorbing. He was uncomfortable with celebrity in a way that was notable given the family he came from. The Onassis world was constantly observed. Journalists, photographers, socialites, hangers-on, the permanent audience that wealthy and famous people accumulate around themselves. Alexander navigated this world because he had no choice, but he found it exhausting rather than energizing. He did not seek attention. He did not cultivate his public image. He would have been, by most indications, happy to be left alone more often than his circumstances allowed. His relationship with Fiona Thyssen, which lasted from the mid-1960s until his death, was the clearest evidence of his capacity for sustained, genuine attachment. This was not a young man moving through relationships. He chose someone, committed to her, and remained committed regardless of the enormous family pressure pushing him in another direction. For someone so young, that kind of constancy was remarkable. Fiona, for her part, spoke about him in the years after his death with a grief that was evident and unperformed. She described someone kind, funny, serious, when seriousness was called for, and deeply loyal. His relationship with his sister Christina was close and protective in a way that both of them seemed to need. Christina was more volatile, more publicly demonstrative, and would go on to have a spectacularly turbulent life. Alexander was the steadier of the two, the one more likely to be listening than talking. People who knew them together said he watched out for her in the specific way that older siblings develop when they've grown up in an unstable household. His relationship with his father was the most complicated thing in his life. He loved Aristotle. That seems beyond question. He also chafed against him, resented the control, and was engaged in the long, slow work of separating himself enough to be his own person without severing what connected them. He was making progress at that. He had taken on real responsibilities in the business. He had held his ground on the things that mattered to him personally. He was 24 and still in the process of becoming, which is what makes his death so specifically hard to absorb. Not just the fact of it, but the timing. He had done the hard interior work of figuring out who he was. He had looked at everything his circumstances offered and his circumstances demanded, and he had made choices. Real ones, at real cost. He just never got to live them out fully. There is a particular category of loss that belongs to people who die young, the loss of everything that hadn't happened yet. The books unwritten, the decisions unmade, the person they were in the process of becoming. Alexander Onassis belongs in that category. He was not a finished person. None of us are at 24. But the direction was clear enough that the absence feels sharp. The sense that someone specific, with a specific way of moving through the world, was taken before the world got to see it fully. Segment 2. The world he left behind. When Alexander died, The questions about the Onassis Empire's future sharpened immediately. Aristotle had built everything with the assumption that his son would eventually take it over, not necessarily in the same form, not necessarily using the same methods, but in the general sense of continuation. The tankers, the airline, the island of Scorpios that Aristotle had purchased and transformed into a private retreat, the homes across multiple countries, all of it had been accumulated with a next generation in mind. Without Alexander, none of that had a clear successor. Christina was the only remaining child, and she was 23 when her brother died. Young, grieving, and already entangled in the first of what would be 4 marriages. She eventually inherited the empire after Aristotle's death in 1975, and she ran it. She ran it with effort and seriousness, and she grew into the role in ways that surprised people who had underestimated her. She navigated the shipping business through difficult years, made hard decisions, and proved that her father's dismissiveness about her abilities had been wrong. But she was also profoundly unhappy in ways that the business could not address. She struggled with her weight, her health, her relationships, the loneliness that seems to attach itself to people who have inherited everything except peace. She died in Buenos Aires in 1988 at the age of 37, and her death carried the particular sadness of someone who had spent her whole life in the shadow of losses she never fully recovered from. Alexander's death was the first of them. Aristotle's marriage to Jacqueline Kennedy, which had taken place in 1968, 5 years before Alexander's death, added another layer of complexity to everything. The marriage had already become strained by the time the crash happened. Jackie and Alexander had a difficult relationship. By some accounts, she found him cold toward her, and he had not hidden his disapproval of the marriage. It was one of the few things he and Christina agreed on completely. After his death, the marriage between Aristotle and Jackie deteriorated further and rapidly. They spent long stretches apart. He spoke about her bitterly in private. He began pursuing a divorce before his own health made that irrelevant, and she was reportedly in New York when he died in Paris in March 1975. The marriage had, in the end, been one more thing that the loss of Alexander had hollowed out. The mythology of the Onassis family has a particular texture to it, the sense of people who had more than anyone could want, and who were, nonetheless, not protected from anything. The wealth bought islands and yachts and the best medical specialists money could access, and none of it mattered on January 23rd, 1973, when a plane came down too fast on a runway in Athens. Alexander is buried on Scorpios, the private island that was one of his father's proudest possessions. Aristotle is buried there too, as is Christina. The island itself was eventually sold by Christina's daughter, Athena Roussel Onassis, the last of the direct line, who has largely stayed out of the public eye and distanced herself from the family's legacy. Scorpios passed through several ownership changes after that. The graves remain on the island, a small cluster of loss in a place that was once the center of a world that seemed impervious to ordinary human sorrow. But to understand why this loss hit as hard as it did, why it undid Aristotle so completely, you have to understand who Alexander actually was, separate from the name and the Heir narrative that surrounded him, because the person underneath was more interesting than the story that got written about him. Segment 1. What was lost, and what the name cost. Alexander didn't choose to be Aristotle Onassis's son. He didn't choose the shipping empire or the island or the yacht or the permanent audience. He was born into it, and like most people born into extreme circumstances, he spent much of his life negotiating with the conditions of his birth, rather than simply inhabiting them. The flying was part of that negotiation. Fiona was part of it. The quiet, the preference for technical work over social performance, the dry humor in private. All of it was the work of someone trying to carve out a self inside a set of circumstances that left very little unclaimed territory. The name Onassis had a particular gravity to it, not just wealth, though it was that too, but expectation. People saw Alexander and they saw a continuation, a future tycoon, an heir. The name preceded him into every room and defined what people assumed before he had spoken a word. Growing up inside it was not the same thing as benefiting from it. There was benefit, obviously, comfort, access, a world that opened doors before you reached for the handle. But there was also the weight of it, constant and specific. He handled it with more grace than might have been expected. He wasn't the kind of rich young man who destroys things for attention. He was patient, quietly accumulating what was actually his, the skills, the relationship, the private sense of self, while managing the obligations that came with the name. He was succeeding at it, slowly, in the way that takes years and costs arguments and involves a lot of staying where you said you'd stay when it would have been easier to move. He was becoming someone. The questions that people who knew him kept returning to, in interviews, in memoirs, in quiet conversations, were less about the crash and more about what would have followed. Would he have taken over the business? Would he have married Fiona? Would he have found a way to be Aristotle's son without being only that? No one knows. That's the nature of lives cut short. They leave behind an unanswerable question in the shape of a person. Alexander's particular question has the texture of someone who had almost gotten there, almost figured out the balance, almost made it to the other side. He was on a runway in Athens on a winter morning, and then he was gone. And the name that had been both his inheritance and his burden passed into the history of the 20th century as something belonging to the man who built it, rather than to the young man who had been quietly, persistently, figuring out what he wanted to do with it. Alexander Onassis was born into a world that most people can barely imagine, and he spent his short life trying to make something human-scaled inside it. He found love in a relationship his father disapproved of. He found passion in a pursuit his father resented. He found himself, slowly, in the particular way that takes years of stubborn private work, the kind that doesn't show up in photographs or newspaper columns, but that accumulates quietly in a person until they become recognizably themselves. He was 24 years old when a plane came down on a runway in Athens, and 33 hours later he was gone. His father, who had survived poverty and displacement and the collapse of an entire city and the ruthless competition of the international shipping world, did not survive losing him. Not really. The island where they are both buried sits in the Ionian Sea. Quiet now, no longer the center of anything, just water and stone and the graves of people who had everything the world calls important and who lost, in the end, the things that actually mattered. Alexander Onassis never inherited the empire his father built. He never got to find out what kind of man he would have become at 30, at 40, at the age his father was, when he was still just beginning to build something. We are left only with what we know of him at 24. Quiet, determined, in love, in the air, and almost there. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.